Good morning. It is 8 o'clock a.m. and you know that at the forum we start promptly at 8. Welcome to all of you. The four of us who facilitate and organize the forum, Julianne File, Barbara Bynum in the back, Phoebe Benziger, and I, are always open to suggestions for topics. And this happens to be one of those. Melissa Sullivan, thank you, recommended that we invite Charles to speak today, and we contacted him and he was willing to do that. We feel very privileged to have Charles Geoffrion. He is a 6-month resident of Montrose, 6 months of the Tucson area, and he brings with him a wealth of information about this topic. He is currently on the board of directors of Surface Biology, Inc. He has held numerous positions at the University of Arizona, including Adjunct Associate Research Scientist in the Office of Arid Lands Studies, and campus-wide Associate Vice President for Research, Research Integrity Officer, Director of Research Communications, and Associate Dean for Development and External Relations at the University of Arizona College of Science. He has also consulted with USAID, the U.S. State Department, and for various international foundations on environmental and research projects in developing nations in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and South America. Currently, Charles serves as the president of Pima County, Arizona Board of Health, based in Tucson. And over the years, Charles has been staying current with the topic of the impact of heat on human health, along with the general issue of climate change and global warming. And I think none of us would argue that climate change and global warming is happening. I cited last week, I got on my weather forecast on my phone at 10 p.m. and it was 113 in Phoenix at 10 p.m. So it's certainly a topic we're all interested in, invested in. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker who will educate us on this topic. Charles.
Thank you, Kathy. Not only did Melissa Sullivan make a connection for me with you all, but I get my llama poop from her, which helps our garden quite a bit. You may all notice the smoke in the air this morning. The sunrise was very red. Anyway, before I start, I just want to get one thing out of the way. I speak Bostonian, so if any of you have trouble understanding me, my lovely wife is here to interpret. She and I, by the way, just a few days ago celebrated our 60th anniversary. We've been coming to Montrose for about 12 years now, 14 years. My wife's brother and his lovely wife, who's here today, introduced us to this area, and we fell in love with it very quickly. So I'm happy to share some of our concerns and issues with this community. I grew up in Boston. My parents came down from Montreal during the Depression years. So we all have some immigration in our background, which makes America great. And I'm really happy to be proud of that. My father's mother was an Abenaki. And so we have all sorts of mix, which is important to us. So today I'm going to run through a bunch of facts that will be helpful, I think, to understand this issue. And that's what I wanted to start with. Okay, I want to make sure I have your attention. I use that sometimes with undergraduate students who are texting or sleeping. And but Warren and I were over in the Peace Corps in Africa many years ago, and we lived among the Timni people, and there was a proverb there that made a lot of sense to me, and I used it a lot. No matter how hot the water in your well, it won't cook your rice. And I think that is an important sentiment to say, it's one thing to think about something, but you got to work at it. You got to do something to make it really cook. So that's where we are. This is jumping ahead here. This is the section I want to run through fairly quickly today because I want to leave time for conversation and some questions and maybe some answers. But we'll get through this. So how do we know about global warming? And this is important because currently we're living in a society where there's a lot of doubt and misinformation and science and technology, artificial intelligence, all those issues are concerning people to the point where some people are getting very nervous about what's going on in our country and in our world. Well, modeling is one way we know things. And modeling is an issue that is extremely complex. But if you see these areas here, there's a lot of data being fed right now into supercomputers. And that's what climatologists use to come up with their understanding. And remember, science is self-correcting, which is why people sometimes say, well, wait a minute, you said this last month or last year, and now you're changing. Well, the fact is that the data changes, and we learn more as we go forward. And so that's why these data streams that are coming in are constantly being updated. So let's go and look at some background information. If we go into our pre-science world, smallpox treatment, which was a big deal then, 12 bottles of small beer every 24 hours, maybe that would have been the choice. But eating melons or wearing red cloth, I don't know. Some basics here again. You've heard a lot about 1.5 centigrade or Celsius. That's what the Paris Agreement used as a target for our goal to keep the warming of the Earth that or below. In 2024, for the first time, we exceeded that in the modern era slightly, and then it fell back slightly below. But that's where we are now. In Fahrenheit, that would be 2.7. Somebody will say, well, 2.7 degrees, what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal because the Earth system responds to these, what they call forcings in the atmosphere. So what is global warming? It's not Republican or Democrat or independent. It's not any of the religions or theologies or politics. It's not nonsense and it's not a hoax. It's basically, physics and biology and chemistry. These are the natural forces on the Earth that respond to stimuli that affect them. And there's no choice. I mean, when you heat something, you put water on to boil. When it gets to a certain temperature, it boils. And that's basic science. So our challenge is to connect reality of our daily lives to the abstraction of climate's warming. And that's a difficult challenge for some people. Some people, what do? They avoid. Okay, because they want, and this is interesting, protecting existing beliefs. I mean, that's a hard one to get over, especially if you've grown up, in a very narrow channel. You want to avoid undesirable actions, but it may be that freight train coming at you. Negative emotions, we all know how to struggle with that. We don't want to doom scroll. So, and of course there's always those people that say my mind is made up, so don't confuse me with facts. And nowadays we argue about whose facts are real. So let's see if we can get just the facts. The Earth, we're looking at the atmosphere. That's sort of obvious, but I'll point it out anyway. You go up about 20 miles and you're in space. This skin, as it were, of the Earth is thinner relative to the size of the Earth than the skin of an apple is to its apple, to the fruit. And that's the environment in which we've been dumping all sorts of chemicals, especially since the Industrial Revolution began. So we have a very delicate challenge here in terms of managing this dumping ground, if you will. It's a giant sponge. As the air gets warmer, that sponge holds more water. And this is important too. For every 1 degree warmer, there's 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere. And there's 3 to 5% of a reduction in surface stream flow. I live in Tucson in the winter, and Maura and I were faculty members at the university since '86, so we got to know the Arizona scene quite well. Everybody's concerned, obviously, about water from the Colorado River. There are 7 states and 40 million people that are sucking water out of the Colorado River. And if you go back in the 20s and 30s, when the dam was built and the water was allocated among the 7 states, the upper states and the lower states, the rain pattern had been quite aggressive then. We're in what might be a 1,500-year drought cycle right now. Our dendrochronologists, the people that study tree ring, tell us that you go back about 1,500 years and you see this same pattern developing. But when there's a 3 to 5% reduction of surface stream flow, and by the way, I got this from a hydrology magazine that was just talking about the fires up in Beaker and looking at the moisture content of the soil. So when heat from the atmosphere and the sun is warming pulls more moisture out of the soil, when you do have good precipitation and when you do have snow melt in the high country, instead of running down into the streams and flowing into the rivers all the way to Phoenix and Tucson, it gets absorbed by that dry soil. So not enough of it gets into it's preserving the watershed at the local level, which of course Western Slope people care a lot about. And of course that battle's going to focus strongly in the next 6 or 8 months, because in 2026 the agreement of the 7 states expires. And either those 7 states are going to figure out how to agree and cooperate, or the federal government is going to come in and tell us all. A friend of mine from Kansas used to say how the cow ate the cabbage. So,
as Charles said, the 1 degree is at Celsius or Fahrenheit?
These are Fahrenheit.
So 1 degree.
I'm sorry, 1 degree Celsius
Okay.
increase is 7% and 3.5. Yeah. So we're dumping a lot of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. We all hear about CO2 a lot. Methane is actually almost 80 times more of a global warming chemical in the atmosphere. It doesn't last as long as CO2, which is the good news. Sorry, I think I'm jumping with this thing. Okay, got to make sure I've got it correct. The ocean, you know, for a while back in the late 90s, there was all this talk about, oh, see, the data was wrong because all of a sudden there was a leveling off of the rate of warming. But what they found after 5 or 6 years of data analysis was that the ocean was absorbing a lot of the atmospheric heat. At some point, the ocean is saturated to the point where it's going to start giving off some of that heat. And right now, you can see that up here, and this data, we don't have 2025 data yet, but this line here is where we are right now, and probably moving up compared to this spaghetti, if you will, of the lines representing years since '79. So you see 23 was already a big jump, 24 is even higher, and who knows where 25 is going to be. So the warming affects, particularly in the spring, with insects, with plants that sprout early, and sometimes they flower early, and then the insects aren't ready, the cycles are off, and they miss their target. And that's something we're watching very closely. Again, little numbers, but to me, and you'll hear this many times or see this on the screen, trends are what we need to watch. It's not just a little number here or a little number there. And we'll get into trends in a little bit. Just on a personal level, I'm sure a lot of you fly from time to time, and the airline industry is really challenged right now with the heat, in terms of fuel consumption, in terms of lift, and in terms of clear air turbulence. That's why we always wear a seatbelt. You know, talking about science and misinformation and conspiracy theories, I assume most, if not all of you, have heard of chemtrails. I was in the men's room down in Phoenix after a funeral, and this guy next to me said, "Did you see that chemtrail out there? The government is trying to kill us." And I said, "Well, you know, the government wants me to pay my taxes, so I'm not sure they want to kill me, but that's out there." If you go on the internet and you see, or TikTok or all these other things, you see the most outrageous conspiracy theories. These trails are nothing but condensation, which is a function of moisture in the atmosphere and temperature, and the hot air coming out of the back of a jet engine. Okay, planetary boundaries. In the last 20 years or so, this has become an issue, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we're looking at freshwater, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, ozone depletion, and so on. And where you're in the green, you're in a safe area. Where you've seen the orange extending, you're looking at serious degradation of those boundaries. And so if you look at this just at an aggregate level, you'll see why where we are right now is concerning. Heat domes. Did I go by one? Yep, I did. Okay, maybe it's the next one. Heat waves. You know, before the kind of warming that we have been experiencing in the last 30, 40 years, there was a pattern of the jet stream that would move from west to east at a fairly predictable, with some perturbations. But above it, the Arctic was significantly colder than the latitudes in which we live. And that jet stream occasionally would dip down or dip up, but generally speaking, it had this pattern from west to east. The Arctic region, the polar regions, are warming 2 to 3 times faster than the equatorial and moderate latitudes. As a result of which, the difference, this barrier of cold air, has been reduced, and it's allowed that jet stream to really wander quite a bit. So sometimes in the winter you'll get that polar vortex as a result. And then everybody who's cold says, well, there can't be any global warming. But then in the summer we have heat domes. And that's exactly what's going on right now. Particularly, I'm just coming in this morning on the radio, I was listening in Spain, Portugal, Greece. There are unprecedented fires, and it's 118 degrees in some of these areas, and they don't have the kind of air conditioning that we had in Phoenix and Tucson. So let's look at some trends. Here's a 4-year trend of CO2. I checked it a few weeks ago, and 427.73. Now, CO2 is measured in Mauna Loa, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in a facility that was started by a guy named Keeling, so it's called the Keeling Curve. He measures CO2 out in the middle of the Pacific because that's the sort of the cleanest air sample he can get, rather than measuring it in Denver or wherever. And these data show this kind of a trend just in the last 4 years. Why is this important? Because before and early on in the 1750, early 1800s, and for thousands of years before that, the CO2 level in the atmosphere was roughly 280. So we've gone from 280 to 427 as of 2 weeks ago. Now here's a 445-year trend. And remember, I keep saying, look at the trends. Here is here is a 400,000-year trend. And this is called the hockey stick that Al Gore made famous in his Inconvenient Truth film. If you look at it, it kind of looks like a hockey stick if you like hockey. At any rate, you see what's going on there. So that's 400,000 years. I wish this thing would behave. There's 800,000 years. And you see where it's been perturbating, lots of swings, but never above 300. So we have a much warmer Earth. And I missed one too. Here we go. Kathy told me to point it over there. I remember that. So if you go here, roughly 20 million years ago is where we are now in terms of CO2. What was the Earth like back 20 million years ago? And the answer is, it was very different than it is today. Well, if the CO2 level is 427 today, why isn't it like it was 20 million years ago? And the answer is, thank you, Mother Nature. There's a lag time. It takes a long time, thousands, millions of years, for these systems to adjust to the forcings that they're experiencing. But again, because of the trends, we and our children and their children will experience were predicted. So that's why we say, if you go back to the dinosaur era, and the parts per million of CO2 was about 2,000, and dinosaurs were wandering in the Antarctic region, and then, after millions of years of these natural processes, this grinding, slow process, rock absorbs CO2, plants, of course, do, and the seed does. And over these millions of years, we got down to a cooling area that even went too far, because then we had the glacial era. So back then, when three and a half million years ago, and 400 in that range, sea levels were 80 feet higher. Okay, there were bogs at the South Pole. Lucy was roaming around in East Africa. Remember Lucy? And so we have these kind of situations. Now, if you go back 16 million years and CO2 was 500 or more, sea level 150 feet higher, again, these are all just responses to the amount of heat in the atmosphere. Back then, by the way, Megastatorium was roaming around in Africa. And I thought you might like to get a look at that critter. There he is. They have his bones, his head was, well, this wasn't your average pet dog. They called it a bone crusher because it used to crush its, anyway, that's. The other impacts which bring it home a little bit is, you know what? Warmer air is less dense, so batted balls fly farther. So if you're a baseball fan, you might be interested in that. And you see on the right how the temperature has warmed over these years during the baseball season. Okay, let's look at some conditions including Colorado. I want to make sure I didn't miss, okay, good. This was just from a drought monitor data that I picked up just yesterday. And it's dated in late July. So you see the drought in Colorado, the western slopes are in serious drought. You go down to that little yellow point there, Telluride, and the high peaks there are yellow, but especially in the north, we're looking at some extreme drought. Double the number of wildfires across the country. Stream flow in the Colorado River Basin is below average. August is usually the region's wettest month, but now it seems much drier and hotter than normal. I think my check this morning was going to be in the 90s today here, and certainly Grand Junction is pushing high 90s. When we were looking for land, I spent a day running around in Grand Junction thinking, well, maybe the Palisades, would be a nice place to. No. Montrose was the good choice. The Climate Central has come up with something called a Climate Shift Index, rated 1 to 5. And it's a series of components that determine if the weather we're experiencing, whether it's temperature or drought or rain or storms, flooding, is related to the global warming itself. And I won't go into all the details, but it's a complex matrix of analysis that leads to whether or not a particular weather pattern or weather event is related to global warming. So right now, in 25, the Climate Shift Index for Montrose is rated at 5, which is the highest. global warming in July for Grand Junction area, which is the closest I can get from them. They don't have one specific to Montrose. Again, a trend line from the 70s to closer. The cost of this, in terms of billion-dollar disasters, and I bet there's nobody in this room that hasn't seen their home insurance go up. Mine just got nasty. And the car insurance as well, because the insurance industry, the insurance industry takes insurance with reinsuring industry, and they're all scrambling right now to cover the costs associated with these billion-dollar events. This is data from Phoenix. And when asphalt reaches 180 degrees, and some elderly person with a walker or a cane falls down, and sadly also unhoused people, some of whom are just financially desperate, others unfortunately have issues. But they wind up on the pavement, you get third-degree burns within about 2 minutes. And second-degree burns immediately. These occupations are particularly vulnerable to heat because it's mostly outdoors. In Tucson, for the Board of Health, we developed a policy which the county has now approved, and the city of Tucson as well, that regulates contractors who have a contract with the county or the city. So they have to provide breaks and drinking water and other opportunities for workers to get into a cool environment periodically during the day, depending on the temperature. They tried to do that in Florida, where of course the heat and humidity is even worse, and the governor canceled that because, workers should just work. But who's going to pick our strawberries? Air quality, we've seen that right here in Montrose this morning and late last night. Hopefully I don't know where it's coming from, but Utah, maybe the Mika area if the winds have changed. That fire out yet, Albert? No. And we'll get into this in a few minutes about parts per million and what we breathe in and its effect on our health. This I just threw in here yesterday as well because the bird flu is something I thought I'd share with you briefly in terms of health issues. It's been sort of out of the headlines in the last several months, but public health people are watching very closely because it'll just take one little perturbation in the genetic code of the influenza H5N1, which we know as the avian flu, which we already know in Colorado as well as Texas and I think somewhere in New Jersey maybe. It has entered the dairy cow population. And you can see from this photo how the exposure is not uncommon. There's a protein in the udder of a dairy cow which is susceptible to the viral agent. Fortunately, that has not shifted to affect human beings, although there have been about 70 dairy cow workers who have gotten ill, particularly with conjunctivitis, that pink eye. And there's a protein in the eye surround which is not unlike what's on the udder of the cow. Again, the genetic evolution hasn't shifted yet, but if it does, and it's just a chance issue, it's kind of a rolling the dice, it could then become susceptible to entering the human airways, particularly the nasal passages, the throat, the lungs. Frankly, not unlike what we went through with COVID. So we're watching H5N1 and its migration very closely. Fortunately, the price of eggs have come down a little bit, but you know, when they had to cull millions of laying hens, we all know what that went through not too long ago. I say this because we are in this together. It's so easy to think, oh, well, those problems in Indonesia or in Central Africa or the Middle East are the problems for them folks. But it's not. You know, I remember when Mount Pinatubo blew, that volcanic eruption in the Philippines in the 80s, and Maura and I had just gone to Tucson, and every night there was the most magnificent sunset. Why? Because the ash and CO2 from that volcanic eruption way over the other side of the earth had finally reached over the Pacific and was entertaining us every night with patterns of color as the sun was setting. So all of these what's called polycrises are underway. And what's happening in Sumatra is kind of possibly knocking on our doorstep at some point. Including food issues. We'll get into that a little bit more. But food insecurity is when systems do not provide sufficient culturally acceptable, nutritious, and safe foods. When Maura and I were in the Peace Corps in Africa, we had from the Catholic Relief Service and from CARE bags and bags of bulgur, cornmeal, and 5-gallon tins of cooking oil, and we used that to provide food for starving people, and particularly pregnant women and children under 5. Made a big difference in the health of the people of Sierra Leone. We did that for 2 years and felt it was a privilege for us to do that. At 90 degrees, the proteins that power the pollen grain's metabolism break down. What does that mean? Well, you know, we're not going to get from the canola seed what you expect and what you need for good health. And these are scenes from places that you don't want to live right now. But, you know, this planetary arc that we refer to, it's just crazy out there. People are living under some very challenging environmental conditions. This is Cairo Doki. I spent a little time on the edge of that, staying in a hotel that was in Doki, because the fancy hotels in Cairo were being bombed by terrorists. So while I was there consulting with the National Research Center, they put me up in a nice hotel in Doki, but it was safer there. Karachi, you know, this is interesting. There are so many cities like this. This is in Pakistan. But the air is just toxic all the time. And it's all concrete construction. So it absorbs the heat of the day and gives it off at night. So it never cools down. Very few people have air conditioning. Kathy's husband asked me this morning, So can the human body acclimate? And I said, yeah, you know, when Maura and I went to Africa for the first time, some Peace Corps people met us over in Freetown. We had left from New York. And they had sweaters on. It was January. And we were peeling every layer we could off because we were so hot there. But these folks had been in that climate for 2 years and they had acclimated, so their body had adjusted to the heat and humidity of West Africa. But there's a limit to that. You know, the human body can exist within certain parameters. So these people are sort of accustomed to it, but if you have comorbidities, if you have a heart disease, if you're elderly, you know, you die from that kind of exposure. So you four have been iconic. Well, we found a guy who can do it at half the time and at half the cost. So there goes pestilence, war, death, and famine. Climate change is taking the scene now. So now we get back into heat and health impacts. Flooding, bad air and water, COPD, crop failures, the instability that we see in the world, which causes eco-migration. You know, it's interesting with Syria. Tom Friedman, the New York Times, has made this case well. There were a lot of highly conservative people living in the mountains around Damascus, and were happy there up in the hills. And climate change reduced their ability to grow crops in order to feed their families. And so there was this migration, this eco-migration down into Damascus. A lot of young men who lacked three things. And this is partly a cultural thing, but you know, they lacked a job, they lacked an education, they lacked a girlfriend. And so they were primed for radicalization. And then you had 4 million Syrians migrating into Europe across the Mediterranean, trying to get away from the conflict. Eco-migration is a huge problem for us. Pregnancy on heat risk days is an issue. These are general public health threats. I'm sensitive to time here, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through this, but what does extreme heat do to our bodies? Leads to lower blood pressure, makes the heart work harder to push the blood around the body. Symptoms: dizziness, nausea, fainting. I saw a guy once who was throwing up, and he just couldn't admit that it was a heat-related issue, but he had been out in the weather. And but he also, later that winter, when front-wheel drive vehicles came, and this car he was trying to help was stuck in the snow, he kept saying, but it's the back tires that you have to get the sand under. I said, no, this is a front-wheel drive. So anyway, that was his understanding of things. Medications can affect you, and so if you're on any of these categories of meds, you want to be sensitive to exposure to extreme heat. Particularly for children. Their child's body is still developing. They spend more time outdoors. Kids with heat. I've got a grandson who's on the track team in Tucson, and the coach is pretty careful about hydration for these kids. Heart has to work harder to pump blood to the surface of the skin. Affects the kidneys. reduce blood flow to the organs because it's up on your skin. That's why people look flushed and all red sometimes if they're suffering from heat stress. Car crashes, aggressive behavior, all of this has been documented in city after city. And the ER admissions. We have an ER doc with us today. I presume you would confirm that. This is a little graphic we put together in Phoenix for the state of Arizona. Pamphlets we put in hotel rooms. You know, it's funny, people who come in from Germany or Switzerland or wherever to Phoenix for a holiday, even in the summer, and they'll go off hiking at 6 or 7 in the morning, but by 10 in the morning it's 108 degrees and there's a brutal sun, and they haven't brought enough water, and the next thing you know there's a helicopter taking them to the ER. Wildfire smoke spreads infectious disease as well as the particulate matter that we'll see in a minute. And haboos, these dust storms, this is particularly common in Arizona, particularly in central Phoenix area. Casa Grande is halfway between Tucson and Phoenix. You get that in your lungs, and it's an issue. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I want to leave time for questions. Keep your batteries safe in the heat because, I mean, even in Tucson, I had to change a 5-year guarantee or warranty on my car battery after 3 years. And it was just a function of the heat. And of course, our newest character on the scene, Candida auris, a fungus, which has about a 60% mortality rate for people that have comorbidities and are elderly if they get it. We often have some form of fungus on our skin and there's no problem. But if this particular version gets on your skin and you happen to have a cut and it gets in your blood, it becomes serious. And this Candida auris is spreading because the climate is warming and it is more effective in a warmer climate. Children, again, eco-anxiety. I know when COVID first presented, I wanted my grandkids to look at a special that was on CNN about the what was incorrectly called the Spanish flu back in 1918. And they didn't want to see it. And I think they had this anxious concern about, you know, I'd just as soon not go there. And I understood that, backed off. Microplastics, that's something that's been discussed in great deal just recently. And it's just crazy, look at that. I mean, it's just, they're finding it in the Swiss Alps on the snow. It goes in the oceans, it's in the fish we eat. I think I missed one, no? Okay. Oh, there. Yeah, this is really impressed me. 80% of the plastic products remain in landfills or dispersed throughout the environment. Now, we've been making plastics a lot since the 1950s. And right now, the oil industry is moving away because you wouldn't know that right now in Washington, but the trend is away from oil. And so they're pushing hard to grow the plastic manufacturing industry. One hopes that they will figure out how to dispose of plastic waste. I'm happy that here in Colorado, I have to bring my reusable shopping bag every day if I forget it. back in the car, I have to go back and get it. But we don't get single-use plastic bags any longer, which is one step forward. And then, of course, the mosquito. West Nile virus has been present in Colorado. And Lyme disease with the tick. This is a map that came to us from the health people in Mexico. And again, it's just the trends. And dengue fever, hemorrhagic fever is pretty aggressive, and it's spread by mosquitoes. Zika, of course, you remember a few years ago from Brazil with the hydrocephalic children. And then chikungunya, a name that comes from Africa. It basically translates to break bone disease. And the reason why they call it that is because you feel like every bone in your body's been broken. And so 2 to 550 just in 22 is the latest data I could get from the Sonora region of northern Mexico. But that spills right over into the Tucson area. And as the climate warms, those mosquito populations move north. Okay, so we'll end with some positives, I think. In Phoenix, they've developed a procedure now with these almost like body bags full of ice. So when they find somebody that's their core body temperature is 104 or something in that order, they literally wrap them in ice. In New Delhi, they're doing the same with these tubs. Did I miss one? Nope, okay. This is also good news. I mean, in 1954, the world had met 1 terawatt of solar power, which is a lot of energy. Second came in 24, the third will come later this year. So the trend from solar, Tucson Electric has got a huge facility now. They're pushing almost 30% of their production now is solar or wind. So it's growing very fast, even though the political winds right now are sort of shifting direction. But hopefully even Montrose County might agree at some point to allow solar installations. Tony can tell you more about that. That's my house in Montrose on the left. We're all on solar. That's my house in Tucson on the right. In June it was 108 air conditioning for a 4,000 square foot house. I paid them $25. I pay more in Montrose just to have an account, but like $30 is all I paid at the MEA. The biosphere, that's another good thing. It's a long story I can tell you another time, but this is in Arizona, just north of Tucson. And it was a huge project that had all sorts of interesting goals to allow people to figure out how to live on Mars. And of course it failed. It's now been given over by the people who built it, a guy named Ed Bass, a very wealthy Texan. And the University of Arizona now manages it for some very serious and helpful research in terms of environmental, what's happening to the soils and plants and whatnot. But their conclusion was, we live in this biospheric package to survive. And Earth is the only place. US and India have cooperated with this new satellite that's about to go up, and it will really help to, it crosses the globe and maps the globe every few hours, and will literally be able to predict and or alert people to events for first responders, and to basically get really good data for our continuing research on this issue. This is Sierra Leone. I just love this picture. These are $50 laptop computers with solar charging. And these kids are really learning science. So it can be done. So it's up to us. We're the answer. We're coming together, and I'm really pleased that you're here today. Friends, neighbors, and then even others. We give them facts. We know the source of those facts. Yeah, and even talk to scientists once in a while. And I like the last one, vote. There you go. So that's my last slide. And it's important to value nature and preserve it. Do what we can, because it means a lot to all of us and to our children. So thank you for spending time on this.